A name that most people never heard. A story that never made the front page the way it should have. A mystery that sat quietly for years, until a top criminal profiler sat down, reviewed every detail, and said something that stopped everyone in the room cold. What he revealed wasn't just disturbing. It was the kind of revelation that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about this case. The possible motive he described wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. According to the profiler, this was something far more calculated, far more personal, and far more chilling than anyone had publicly acknowledged before. Nancy Guthrie, a real person, a real life, a real family left searching for answers in the dark. And now, for the first time, a trained expert in criminal behavior has stepped forward with a theory so detailed, so psychologically specific, that law enforcement cannot afford to ignore it. But before we get to what the profiler revealed, before we get to that moment that left investigators leaning forward in their chairs, you need to understand the full story, because the motive, if real, only makes sense when you know who Nancy Guthrie truly was and why someone may have wanted her world to fall apart. Nancy Guthrie is not a celebrity in the traditional sense. She is not someone whose face appears on magazine covers or whose name trends on social media for glamorous reasons. But in certain circles, in communities where faith, grief, and raw human pain intersect, Nancy Guthrie is one of the most recognized and deeply respected voices in the country. She is an author, a speaker, a woman who has built an entire public ministry out of the most devastating personal losses imaginable. Nancy lost a child, not once, but twice. Her daughter Hope, born in 1998, lived only 199 days before passing away from a rare metabolic disorder called Zellweger syndrome. Then, just 2 years later, her son Gabriel was born with the same condition. He survived only 183 days, 2 babies, 2 funerals, 1 mother left standing. And instead of disappearing into grief, instead of collapsing under a weight that would have destroyed most people, Nancy Guthrie did something extraordinary. She started talking. She started writing. She started hosting retreats for other grieving parents, other broken families, other people drowning in a pain the world didn't know how to acknowledge. She became a beacon for the suffering. Her books, including Holding On to Hope and the Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament Bible Study series, have sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Her respite retreats have provided lifelines to families who had nowhere else to turn. She is, by every measure, a woman who turned catastrophic loss into profound purpose. So why would anyone want to target her? Why would a trained criminal profiler look at the circumstances surrounding Nancy Guthrie's life and identify a disturbing possible motive? That is the question at the heart of this story, and the answer, when it finally comes, is going to make you pause. Because what the profiler found wasn't about Nancy's grief. It was about something far more dangerous. It was about what she represented, and to whom she represented a threat. Nancy Guthrie grew up in a world shaped by faith and family. She was raised with an understanding that life carried weight, that the things you believed mattered, that the choices you made echoed beyond yourself. She wasn't someone who stumbled into public life by accident. She was someone who was quietly, deeply shaped by her experiences from the very beginning. A person whose interior life was always richer and more complex than what appeared on the surface. In her early adult years, Nancy married David Guthrie. By all accounts, their marriage was a partnership rooted in shared values, shared faith, and a shared vision for life. They were not wealthy. They were not powerful in the political sense. They were ordinary people trying to build something real. And then life tested them in ways that most people cannot imagine. When Hope was born and diagnosed with Zellweger syndrome, doctors explained that the condition was terminal. There was no treatment, no cure, no miracle waiting around the corner. Nancy and David made a decision that many people found incomprehensible. They chose to bring Hope home, to love her completely for every day she had, to hold her and sing to her and let her feel that she was wanted and treasured. Not a tragedy to be managed, but a life to be celebrated. Those 199 days changed Nancy forever, not because they broke her, though they could have, but because they revealed to her something about the nature of love that cannot be learned any other way. When hope died, Nancy expected the grief to consume her. And for a while, it did. But what happened next changed everything. She discovered that her pain had given her access to other people's pain in a way that nothing else could have. That her brokenness had become a kind of credential, a permission slip to sit with others in their darkest hours without flinching. And then Gabriel came, and the diagnosis came again, and Nancy made the same choice. Another 183 days. Another goodbye. By the time Nancy Guthrie emerged from those years, she was not the same person who had entered them. She was someone who had passed through a fire that most people never survive, and she had come out the other side carrying something rare and powerful, a voice that the suffering would trust. Nancy Guthrie's rise to public influence was not the kind that happens overnight. There were no viral moments, no explosive controversy that thrust her name into headlines. It was slow, quiet, built one grieving parent at a time. Her first book, Holding On to Hope, published in the early 2000s, spoke directly into a silence that the Christian publishing world had largely avoided. Grief, real, ugly, faith-shaking grief, not the sanitized version where everything resolves neatly in the final chapter, the kind of grief that makes you question everything you thought you believed. Readers responded with a ferocity that surprised even her publisher. Letters poured in. Emails arrived from strangers on opposite sides of the world who said, simply, "You said what I could not say. You felt what I thought no one else had felt." The respite retreats she and David began hosting drew couples from across the country, parents who had lost children and had no community, no language, no framework for surviving what they were enduring. Nancy gave them that framework, and as her influence grew, so did the complexity of her position, because when you become a trusted voice for the broken, when you become the person that thousands of people turn to in their worst moments, you also become something else entirely, a target. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes the threat is quieter, more insidious, more personal, and this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Few people knew that there had been something troubling building around Nancy Guthrie's name. The specifics, as reported and discussed in investigative communities, involve circumstances serious enough that a trained criminal profiler felt compelled to weigh in publicly. And when that profiler sat down and reviewed the available information, the behavior patterns, the context, the relational dynamics, the possible motivations, what emerged was not a simple picture. His analysis pointed to something that investigators often call targeted grievance motivation. This is not random hostility. This is not impulsive anger. This is a pattern where an individual or individuals fixate on a specific person, not because of who that person is in a criminal sense, but because of what that person represents to them emotionally or psychologically. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the profiler suggested that her visibility as a grief figure, her platform, and her deeply personal public narrative may have made her a focal point for someone experiencing their own unresolved pain, anger, or instability. The profiler was careful, measured, but unmistakably serious. He noted that individuals who build platforms around surviving catastrophic loss, sometimes unknowingly, attract people who are themselves processing unresolved trauma, and that for a small but dangerous subset of those individuals, admiration can curdle into something else entirely, resentment, obsession, the irrational belief that someone else's public peace, someone else's apparent survival and purpose is an accusation against their own inability to cope. She healed. I didn't. That means something is wrong, and it might be her fault. It is a psychological pattern that sounds extreme until you understand how grief can warp perception when it goes unprocessed for long enough. The profiler said something else that lingered in the air long after the conversation ended. He said that the most dangerous person in a case like this is rarely a stranger. It is almost always someone on the periphery, someone who watched, someone who listened, someone who felt seen by the public figure's words, and then, for reasons that may never be fully rational, felt betrayed by them. This moment would define the entire investigation going forward, because suddenly the question was no longer just what happened, The question became, who was watching Nancy Guthrie, and what were they feeling when they did?